Today we're considering the nomination of Dr. Colleen Shogan to be the Archivist of the National Archives and Record Administration. The committee is holding a second hearing on this nomination at the request of our minority colleagues. And I hope that my colleagues will use this additional opportunity to ask substantive questions and evaluate Dr. Shogan's qualifications both carefully and fairly. Dr. Shogan, welcome back, and congratulations once again on your nomination. And thank you for your willingness to serve in this very important position. You are exceedingly well qualified to serve as the next Archivist of the United States, and I hope to see you confirmed very quickly to this very important role. Throughout your career, you have served in several nonpartisan leadership positions with both dedication and integrity. And during last year's nomination hearing, you demonstrated keen judgment, a deep understanding of the importance of the archivist role, and a firm commitment to nonpartisanship and transparency. Last Congress, some of my colleagues raised concerns about potential partisan bias. However, your extensive track record shows that these claims to be unfounded. This committee has heard from many individuals and organizations who attest to Dr. Shogan's expertise and ability to work in a nonpartisan manner. These include the American Political Science Association, the Council of State Archivists, the American Historical Association, and other national, nonpartisan, and non-political organizations who I will say have enthusiastically endorsed Dr. Shogan's nomination. I will enter all of the letters of support into the hearing record, which there are many here. The National Archives and Records Administration is the federal agency charged with maintaining and preserving presidential and federal records. Recent events have highlighted longstanding issues with presidential records management and classification, and I understand that many of my colleagues are eager for more information on these issues. But I want to stress that as you told us in your previous hearing, you are not able to provide details about current investigations related to presidential records because, and this is a good reason, you do not currently work at NARA. Pretty straightforward. For my committee colleagues, this is an area that this committee has been actively engaged in, and it's an area that we will continue to be engaged in as we continue to examine this issue here in Congress. Last Congress, I convened a hearing to examine records management challenges and potential reforms. Following that hearing, I drafted legislation that will strengthen existing laws and modernize record-keeping processes. And I look forward to working with Ranking Member Paul and other members of the committee to build on this work from last Congress to advance bipartisan legislation that will strengthen our records preservation laws. Today, I hope to have a constructive dialogue about the current challenges facing the National Archives, and Dr. Shogan, your plans for addressing those. The National Archives faces large backlogs of public records requests and requests from military personnel records that are essential, absolutely essential to ensuring veterans and service members receive the benefits that they deserve and have earned. The archivist will also be responsible for leading the transition to electronic records across the federal government. Conferring Dr. Shogan as the next archivist will help the National Archives address these challenges. Assuring the full and accurate preservation of our nation's history is a monumental task and requires an independent, nonpartisan leader dedicated to serving the American public. I am confident that Dr. Shogan is the right choice to serve as the next National Archive. Today, I look forward to hearing more from you, Dr. Shogan, about your experiences and your qualifications and how you plan to serve. Again, thank you for being before us a second time. With that, Ranking Member Paul, you're now recognized for your opening remarks.
Thank you and welcome. My wife and I are big fans of the National Archives and have been there many times and have always felt like it was an organization that was nonpartisan, and I hope it can remain so. Every year, though, tens of thousands of Americans travel to their nation's capital to peacefully stand up for the right to life and participate in the March for Life. It's a quintessential First Amendment activity. Just over a month ago, though, on January 20th, the 50th anniversary of the march, on their way to the march that morning, dozens of marchers decided to stop by the National Archives to see our nation's founding documents, including the Bill of Rights that guarantee their freedom to participate in the march that they were headed to. Rather than being welcomed, as more than 1 million other visitors are each year, these marchers were, many of whom were school-aged children, were met by hostility at the archives and forced to cover up or remove any pro-life messages. This has actually been directly decided by the Supreme Court as far as wearing T-shirts that either criticize or a president or go against a political candidate, that it is actually protected speech even in our schools. You cannot force a student to cover up their shirt, and yet at the archives, they were forced to cover their shirts. In just one example of many from that day, one young woman was standing mere feet from the original Bill of Rights was told, "Cover her shirt," and her shirt read, "Life is a human right." You heard that right. The guards charged with protecting the very parchment our Bill of Rights is written on repeatedly violated the First Amendment rights of marchers in the presence of the actual First Amendment. It's hard to imagine a more offensive way to violate their freedom of speech. While I understand some action has been taken, a more serious investigation is necessary. This is especially true because similar violations occurred at the Air and Space Museum that day as well. This is deeply disturbing that this would happen. Nothing like this can ever happen again, and we must understand who ordered it or tolerated it and the culture that enabled this to happen. And lest anyone think that I'm being partisan about this, while I know of no similar violations of speech from those on the political left, I would have exactly the same position. If someone said they disliked Rand Paul and he was a terrible senator, they have their right to wear that T-shirt. Beyond the museums, the archives is responsible for preserving executive branch documents, and that mission has not been without controversy either. Federal records law should be a strictly nonpartisan affair. Unfortunately, the difference in how archives appear to have handled disputes over documents held by former President Trump and Vice President Pence and President Biden, on the other hand, raise questions about the impartiality of the agency. Specifically, the agency seems to have aggressively publicized the search for documents at President Trump and Vice President Pence's residences, but tried to keep quiet about the documents President Biden kept in at least 3 locations. Well, I think the larger issue here is that really too many things are classified, and that's something that you can have some effect on older documents and whether they remain classified. We really have to get over this. Everything's classified. In fact, it makes oversight of government worse. But even if it is classified, the rules need to be the same for both parties. And it looks as if there was a great deal of, activity on going after the Republicans and not so much for the Democrats. It was basically tea and crumpets, for Biden and FBI and drawing guns for Trump. And so it didn't seem really appropriate to many of us. In another document management matter, the archives investigated allegations that the NIH improperly destroyed key documents related to COVID. This is important because we're still struggling to get information from the NIH. You wouldn't think that a scientific organization was resisting document disclosure, but they are. The conclusion of the investigation seems to be that the archives simply accepted NIH's word that they weren't destroying records. Well, realize this is coming from an agency that you would think would be nonpartisan also, but that is resisting all of our entreaties for information. I've sent more than a dozen letters to the NIH. See, people don't know this. I've sent a dozen letters, some of them signed by 5 senators. The NIH will not give information to the Senate. So we need somebody in a nonpartisan position to say, we've got to make sure they're not destroying records over there. I've yet to receive any of the documents received by these records. I'm hoping the chairman will choose to put some bipartisan heft behind this, but this is a real problem that the government is resisting records release. And I've assured the chairman that if the shoe's on the other foot and there's a Republican administration, I'll sign every document request because there's no government agency that should be able to resist the Senate's request for information. Determining whether any documents provide insight into the origins of COVID, Some of these being improperly destroyed warrants more than just a cursory review and, okay, NIH, we're just going to take your word for it. So today I want to hear what the Archives is going to do, to ensure that records related to the origins of COVID-19 are properly preserved, as well as a commitment to provide us with all the documents related to the investigation into the origins of COVID. Finally, there is a partisan pressure campaign underway to bully the Archivist into unilaterally amending the Constitution. Who would have ever guessed that somehow the Archivist would be involved with amending the Constitution? You think people were mad over the Supreme Court deciding versus the public or legislatures deciding the issue of abortion? Can you imagine if an archivist who is not thought to be someone elected to any kind of office or creating any legislation would somehow be in charge of amending the Constitution? Would alarm even the most cautious of folks. Congress imposed a deadline back in 1982 for the 38 states to ratify the ERA, a deadline that was not met. So we do know the will of Congress on this. Lately, 3 states have attempted to ratify the amendment, notwithstanding the legal deadline. However, there also have been 5 states that have taken back and removed their approval of this. So when something this murky at best, you would think that Congress would be the arbiter of what would happen, or the people at the very least. But these activists who have conveniently ignored these 5 states that have withdrawn their ratification want the Archivist to certify the adoption of the amendment. To this point, the nominee has rightly resisted such calls, but we will be looking for reaffirmation of that today. Thank you, and we welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Ranking Member Paul. It's the practice of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses. So if you will stand and raise your right hand, please. Do you swear the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Today's nominee is Dr. Colleen Shogan, nominated to be Archivist of the National Archives and Records Administration. Dr. Shogan currently serves as Senior Vice President and Director of the David M. Rubenstein Center for White House History at the White House Historical Association and as an adjunct lecturer at Georgetown University. Dr. Shogan also moderates the Emerging Governance Leaders Seminar at the Aspen Institute and serves as a vice chair of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, the bipartisan commission designated by Congress to commemorate the 19th Amendment. Previously, she worked at the Library of Congress for over a decade in a variety of roles. Welcome, Dr. Shogan. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member. And thank you, distinguished members of the committee. Good morning. My name is Dr. Colleen Shogan, and my nomination to serve as the 11th Archivist of the United States is indeed the honor of a lifetime. I am likewise humbled by the opportunity to serve as the first nominated woman in the role. Before I continue, I would like to thank my husband, Rob, for being here today. He has consistently supported my career, and I know this will continue if I am confirmed as Archivist. In 2021, I was diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge my family, my close friends, my work colleagues, doctors, and nurses. They helped make today possible for me, and I am eternally grateful. I am healthy today because of their efforts. I must admit this setting is quite familiar to me. Over 15 years ago, I worked alongside this committee as a congressional staffer. I never imagined I would be sitting on this side of the dais for a confirmation hearing. My passion for the American story started in the public high school I attended outside Pittsburgh, with engaging teachers who taught United States history and government. As a first-generation college student in my family, I was fortunate to receive a first-class education, which allowed me to explore the development and evolution of American ideas and institutions. My reverence for democratic principles, ideals, and governance led me to a career that included positions in academia, federal government service, and nonprofit management. Following my service in the Senate, I spent over a decade directly supporting Congress as a senior leader at the Congressional Research Service and the Library of Congress. I also served as the vice chair of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, which commemorated the anniversary of the 19th Amendment without partisanship. These positions, including the one I hold today at the White House Historical Association, have instilled in me the tremendous value of nonpartisanship and access to trusted sources. I am confident that my years of experience in these unique roles have prepared me well to serve as the Archivist of the United States. The National Archives and Records Administration, often known as NARA, preserves the building blocks of our nation's democracy. NARA does this by enabling access to the government records which tell our national story and the words and images of the people who made history. This is critical for several reasons. First, it provides citizens with answers about family heritage, military service, and governmental decisions. Citizen engagement with archives materials online and in person through our nationwide system of archival research rooms and presidential libraries is a top priority for NARA. The National Archives also provides researchers, historians, genealogists, educators, students, and other stakeholders with trusted information about our shared past. In my own research, I have benefited from examining NARA's records. As a political scientist, I strongly believe we cannot understand our nation's present condition without a comprehensive understanding of the past that brought us here. Along with our other federal cultural institutions, NARA secures the repository of knowledge that enables such understanding for scholars and citizens alike. Additionally, the National Archives provides vital record management services and guidance to all three branches of the government and is leading the government-wide transition to electronic record keeping. Most importantly, NARA safeguards government records in the public trust to enable citizens, such as veterans, to claim their rights, to hold their government accountable, and to participate in the civic process. If confirmed, I will have many hills to climb in this position. I do not assume these challenges lightly. To succeed, we will need to find creative ways to become more efficient, to capitalize upon public-private partnerships, and to engage previously underserved communities in meaningful ways. Of course, NARA must do this as technologies improve at a lightning speed. Government is not always considered nimble when it comes to innovation, but the National Archives can serve as a leader in its transition to a primarily digital future. This will require investing in the archive's talented workforce and making smart business decisions that will propel NARA forward. In a private meditation, Abraham Lincoln likened the principles of the Declaration of Independence to the apple of gold, a phrase contained in the book of Proverbs. Lincoln knew it was his task to move the nation towards a more perfect realization of these principles. As the 250th anniversary of our country approaches, that hard work continues. If confirmed, I look forward to sharing the treasured collection of the National Archives with all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shogan. There are three questions that the committee asks of every nominee, and I'm going to ask you to respond briefly to these questions with just a simple yes or no. First, is there anything you are aware of in your background that might present a conflict of interest with the duties of the office to which you have been nominated?
No.
Second, do you know of anything, personal or otherwise, that would in any way prevent you from fully and honorably discharging the responsibilities of the office to which you have been nominated?
No.
And lastly, do you agree without reservation to comply with any request or summons to appear and testify before any duly constituted committee of Congress if you are confirmed?
Yes. Yes.
Great. Thank you. Dr. Shogan, my first question is, you're not an archivist, a librarian, or a historian. Mm-hmm. So could you tell the committee what experience and skills that you're going to be bringing to the role of Archivist of the United States?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. As I stated in my opening statement, I bring over 15 years of experience in the government sector and in the nonprofit sector in increasing positions of importance. I bring management and supervisory skills to the table, working in all facets of government, including 8 years at the Congressional Research Service, 4 years at the Library of Congress in senior executive positions, and then for the past 3 years as the senior vice president at the nonpartisan nonprofit, the White House Historical Association. I also think I do have a very relevant educational background to serve as the Archivist of the United States. I'm not a historian, I am a political scientist, but my areas of expertise were in American politics, in political philosophy, and in methodology, and I've really focused on the intersection of political science and history, and that has been where my work has focused, which gives me a very good background in the history of ideas and institutions. And lastly, I would highlight that I've performed many of these roles, particularly for the past 15 years, in organizations which their principles and values, most importantly, were of nonpartisanship.
Shogan, your outreach and engagement with the public are absolutely essential parts of NARA's work. If confirmed, what are your priorities for educational outreach?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. This brings a lot of excitement and energy to me because I think that all of our students, all the way from students in elementary school, all the way to graduate students, my vision, my hope is that they will turn to the National Archives first when they are engaging in research and exploration related to social studies, to American history, to civics. I know in this country we do have what some people have referred to as a deficit in a knowledge of American history and in civics. And that is improving and is getting better. But the National Archives can play a major role in helping to close this deficit. And if I am confirmed, I look forward to looking to all kinds of third-party partnerships that would enable more access, more knowledge to students about the treasures. There's over 205 million records online through the National Archives in the catalog. That's just amazing. It is the largest online archive in the world. It's unbelievable. And we need to make sure that we're making use of those records, making sure that they're available to students. And the way we do this is directly to students, but it's also through teachers. And so I would also want to evaluate our teacher professional training outreach. I know that this has been ongoing at the archives. I would like to increase that outreach, increase opportunities for professional training for teachers to use our records in the classroom, and I'd also like to bring back in-person training for teachers to the National Archives, if confirmed.
Great. The next question relates to a problem that has to be resolved. It's an issue incredibly important to me, I think every member on this committee as well. That issue is that NARA is currently facing a backlog of over 300,000 requests for military service records. Now, I was glad to see that last week NARA released a plan to eliminate the backlog by December of this year. Hopefully that will be accomplished. But I think I'd like to hear, if confirmed, what steps you're going to take to ensure that that goal is actually met.
Thank you for that question. This issue is of utmost importance to me. I come from a family of veterans. My father was a veteran. My uncles were veterans, my sister-in-law, and it is of utmost importance. This goes right to the heart of access. Veterans need access to these records so they can claim the benefits that they are guaranteed because of their service to this country. So if I am confirmed as Archivist of the United States, I view this as being a discrete problem of the first magnitude. I plan to travel to the National Personnel Records Center, which is located outside of St. Louis, and be able to view the procedures and processes that are in place right now. They are, as you said, Mr. Chairman, making good progress, and the goal is to reduce and eliminate that backlog by December of 2023, but I would want to travel there and see the processes in place, see what else can be done so that we can speed up that deadline.
Right. I'm sure that if confirmed, you're going to play a key role in the transition to digital records across the scope of the federal government. Can you describe your experience leading efforts to expand digital resources as well as outreach?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. I was lucky enough to be very much involved for the very origins of digital outreach and transformation at the Library of Congress. Was very much involved in the drafting of the first digital digital strategy at the Library of Congress. And I would also point to my current position. As you know, COVID really removed a lot of in-person interactions after its inception. And I think everybody that was working in cultural or historical institutions was faced with the prospect of having to get their information out in ways that they had never approached before. So we were very, very aggressive in this regard at the White House Historical Association. It took a lot of time and effort, but we were able to do things such as go into the White House and create a very innovative 360-degree tour of the White House that we were able to put online, and we were able to engage with students and teachers. And we've made use of that 360-degree tour even, now that people are back in person with COVID, because we know there's people that can't travel to visit the White House. So I would hope to make creative endeavors like the ones that I've done in my previous positions, and to apply those principles and strategies to the National Archives so we could share the National Archives with as many Americans as possible, hopefully in person, but also, of course, through digital means.
Thank you, Dr. Shogan. Thank you for the answers to my questions. I now recognize Ranking Member Paul for his questions.
Do you believe that the archivist has the power to certify amendments to the Constitution when there is a dispute as to how many states have ratified the amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. As I understand it, the function before the Archivist of the United States is what has been described as ministerial in function. So the Archivist publishes an amendment when it is part of the Constitution, not the decider.
Very good, and I think that's exactly right. In some ways, it would probably be similar to sort of the certification of an election. When the vice president comes in, it was thought to be ministerial, not that the vice president had the power to change or alter the election. Will you allow security at the archives to force people to cover clothing that has political speech on it?
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for that question. Absolutely not.
Will you get to the bottom of how it happened to make sure that we don't have people, I don't know if this was a rogue person out there doing this, or if the previous, those in charge were encouraging this, but will you promise to get to the bottom of it?
Absolutely, Mr. Ranking Member.
I think one of the things American people hate most about government is when it appears as if justice or the adjudication of justice is partial. When Lady Liberty's not blind, Lady Justice is not blind, that there are different standards for people depending on their party. And at least from where I sit, a lot of Republicans felt like there was a different standard, and it'd be really in the way the FBI treated Donald Trump and Joe Biden. The bigger problem, though, I think, is that everything's classified. We classify everything. The menu at the White House is supposedly classified. So, we've got problems with too much classification, but it also makes oversight difficult. So, for example, 1 million Americans died from COVID. Somewhere between 12, 15, maybe 18 million people died worldwide from COVID. And I can't get records from the NIH. Because they classify them, or they send them to us. The NIH, I think it was HHS, sent us a 250-page document and redacted the whole thing. This is just sort of an insult, and I don't know how we get to it. You don't have complete control of this, but I think you have some control over the older records. How do you understand your role on the older records with being part of declassifying older records?
Thank you for that question. Yes, as I understand it, the agency that classifies information has the responsibility for and the choice to declassify that information. But there is the National Declassification Center at the National Archives located in Maryland. And if I am confirmed, I plan to, of course, visit the National Declassification Center and also prioritize, as you said, Mr. Ranking Member, the older records that are waiting for declassification, figuring out how we can be most efficient in doing this, and how we can strengthen relationships with those classifying agencies, those classifying entities, so that we are able to move some of these older documents through the process. I agree with that.
And really, just for the record here on the presidential, controversy, What we're stuck with now is, millions of dollars will be spent on these investigations, and there should be an investigation of neither Biden nor Trump nor Pence on this. They should be told, what these are the rules, and we should try to work with people that were in office. I think we're not going to find that the secrets to making, a nuclear weapon were at someone's house. I think we're going to find that a lot of stuff's classified that doesn't need to be classified. But it began with sort of a witch hunt for Trump. Everybody loved it. They loved, the media cackled and rubbed their hands together, and it went on for weeks and weeks. They had Donald Trump. They were going to get him. They're going to put him in jail like all the rest of the governments, that are controlled by one party around the country. They just had glee until Biden was found to have records in a much less secure place next to his, Corvette in his garage. But I think we've overreacted to both. And I've talked with the chairman and others on the other side that we need to do something about this overclassification problem. And what little part you can be of it, and I realize and don't want you to create law, but what you can do on the older records, I think we would appreciate trying to get less. And I look forward to working with the chairman on trying to change this, because we can't have true oversight of government if HHS and NIH is telling us, it's none of your business. I mean, we really have to get a hold of what's going on. And to me, the COVID thing isn't about Biden at all. A lot of this happened in the previous administration, so it shouldn't be partisan at all. We should all want to find these records. I'm going to reserve my time for later, if that's okay.
That's fine. Senator Paul, thank you. Senator Johnson, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start just by making an appeal to the chair, not only of the full committee, but also to my new chair of Permanent Subcommittee Investigations. We have Senator Marshall, Senator Paul, myself are very interested, as I think the American public is, in the origin of COVID. I think with the recent revelation now, the Department of Energy is tending toward a leak from a lab. We need to understand exactly how COVID started so we can prevent it from happening in the future. I think this committee, we have the investigatory background, certainly my subcommittee does, and I would truly encourage the chairs of the full committee and permanent subcommittee of investigation to cooperate with us and, quite honestly, start a full-fledged committee investigation into the origins. I think it's extremely important, as well as other aspects of our response to COVID, which I certainly have my viewpoint on that. The House is doing so, I think, in a pretty bipartisan fashion. There should be nothing partisan about this whatsoever. So I really encourage you as chair of the full committee and Senator Blumenthal to cooperate with us in those investigations. Ms. Shogan, in the third question that is standard in terms of asking nominees before the committee, do you agree without reservation to comply with any request or summons to appear testified before a duly constituted committee of Congress? If you're confirmed, you answer that in the affirmative. I'm asking, do you agree that that should be request from the minority as well?
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Johnson, for that question. If I am confirmed, I will be responsive to any requests or inquiries that you have, any members on this committee have, or any members of the United States Senate or Congress within compliance of existing law. I will do that.
So there was an Office of Legal Counsel opinion in 2001 which took a look at the language of the Presidential Records Act, where it's talking about to the extent or matter within his jurisdiction to any committee or subcommittee thereof, if such records contain information as needed for the conduct of its business that is not otherwise available. There's no mention of the majority, the minority, or a chairman of a committee or chairwoman of a committee making that request. But the Office of Legal Counsel said that it's only a request from a chair. So I understand that's the legal standard put forth by the Department of Justice, a agency within the executive branch. But I would argue, and I've certainly experienced this, that it has dramatically hampered the rights of the minority to get to the bottom of what's happening in government. In your testimony, you mimic the website of the archives in terms of what the purpose of the archives is. According to the archives website, in a democracy, records belong to the people. Records help us claim our rights and entitlements, hold our elected officials accountable for their actions, and document our history as a nation. NARA ensures continuing access to the essential documentation of the rights of American citizens and the action of the government. In your testimony, you said you'll be there to safeguard government public records so that the citizens can claim their rights to hold government accountable. With that Office of Legal Counsel's opinion, if you've got the presidency held by one party and both branches of government held by the same party, half the country, through their elected representatives, have no access to records. Do you understand that?
Senator, I will need to get back to you on the OLC opinion that you're citing. I believe, as you said, that was issued during the presidency of George W. Bush. But once again, I want to promise to be as responsive as possible under the dictates of the law to yourself, to other members of this committee, and to members of the United States Senate and all members of Congress. Because I do believe, Senator, what you stated is correct. The National Archives holds the records of the United States in custody for the American people. But the American people, it's their records. And I look forward to sharing them with as many Americans as possible while following the law.
So, by the way, I think current Majority Leader Schumer had an issue with that same Office of Legal Counsel opinion back in 2018. I actually agree with Senator Schumer. I think it is absurd if you believe in transparency of government, if you believe that these records are the records of the people, that in certain circumstances there is no possibility for the minority party to get access to records from the administration, so we can't hold them accountable, and the American public cannot get information that it completely deserves to have. I mean, do you agree with that position? Do you understand the quandary, the problem with that opinion?
Senator, I do understand the problem that you're outlining, and once again, I promise if I am confirmed to share as many records as possible with the American people under the dictates of the law.
So if you become archivist here, you'll also be in charge of an agency that in addition to archiving other executive branch information, you'll have potential information yourself. For example, communications between yourself and, in this case, the Department of Justice in terms of how to handle the classified information that is in the hands of President Trump, Vice President Biden, or President Biden and Vice President Pence. I'd like to, with consent, enter two letters, one January 23rd of this year and also February 24th, written by Senator Grassley and myself to the acting archivist, asking for information related to those investigations. We did not get a satisfactory answer in our January request, so we had to follow it up with a February request. The first one just said, if you become activist, this is a question we asked for the acting archivist, will you provide all records between the archives and the Department of Justice relating to the archives' response to our January 23rd, 2023 letter? I mean, will you provide those types of records? Or are you going to hide behind, oh, there's an active investigation, or only a chair can commit this or request this?
Senator, I have not been briefed on any details regarding these incidents due to the Department of Justice investigations. I have not.
I would just ask that you be, as you said, you would be responsive to our requests should you become confirmed, and I'd ask for your commitment to be responsive to our requests.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Hawley, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Shogan, when you were here last year, a number of senators asked you, including me, a series of questions about article you'd written, public statements you had made on social media that were, I have to say, pretty grossly partisan, and I thought offensive, and you and I went back and forth about it. After that, a number of us asked you questions for the record relating to these statements. I want to follow up on one of them. I, in particular, asked you to give us a full accounting of the public posts that you had made on Twitter. You had locked your Twitter account before you came before this committee. It had previously been public. I asked you to provide the public posts that had previously been available on Twitter because the ones that we have were pretty disturbing. You responded as follows, and I quote, "My personal Twitter account is comprised of posts about my mystery novels, events at the White House Historical Association, Pittsburgh sports teams, travels, and my dog," end quote. Is this an accurate statement?
Yes, Senator.
I just remind you, you're under oath. Is this an accurate statement?
Yes, Senator.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your Twitter posts then that I was asking you about. On February 18th, 2022, you posted on Twitter bemoaning the dropping of mask requirements for children, including those under the age of 5. Do you remember that post?
No, Senator. Those tweets were in my personal capacity.
No. I asked you, would you give all public posts that you had made on Twitter? You said no, effectively, and you said that your Twitter posts consisted of mystery novels, events at the White House Historical Association, Pittsburgh sports teams, travels, and my dog. And you just told me now under oath that you stood by that. So now let's talk about your Twitter posts. On February 18th, 2022, you posted bemoaning the fact that mask requirements for children under the age of 5, one of whom I happen to have, by the way, had been dropped. Is that a post about your dog or sports teams?
My social media is in my personal capacity,
Answer
Senator.
my question, please, because you've testified under oath that you only posted about your dog and sports teams and novels, and you also said you wouldn't give this committee any of your public posts. So, is your post on February 18th, 2022, bemoaning the lifting of mask requirements for children under the age of 5, who I might just ask, all of the data has said is extremely harmful to children, these mask requirements? We'll leave that aside for now. Is that a post about your dog or sports teams? Yes or no?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
Yes or no, Ms. Shogan? You are under oath before this committee, and I have to say, you have placed this issue squarely in record by repeatedly refusing to answer. Yes or no?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
So you're not answering my question. Let's talk about another post. 26th of May, 2022. You talk about an assault weapons ban, retweet a post, ban assault weapons now. Say you agree with this idea that you have to be a certain age to buy so-called assault weapons in America. Is that a post about sports teams or your dog or mystery novels?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
What about the post on January 5th of 2021 in which you say that Ted Cruz ought to stay in his own lane and not worry about what's going on in Pittsburgh? This is a reference, I think, to questions he had about the certification of the last election. Is that a post about your dog or sports teams or mystery novels?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
What about the post, you remember December 10th, 2020, where you said that you were hoping that President Trump would have his vetoes overridden, and you agreed with the post that he was a weak policy president? Is that a post about your dog or sports teams or mystery novels?
My social media is in my personal capacity.
What about your post on January 5th, 2021, in which you speculated that President Trump would pardon himself next, participating in a conversation about the certification of the Electoral College? Is that a post about sports teams or mystery novels or your work at the White House Historical Association?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
What about the post? Do you remember this one? I said we seem to be having an incredible case of amnesia, but maybe you remember this one. This is from December 3rd of 2021, in which you advise an individual who goes by Meg on social media that the Library of Congress, you advise this person to complain about religious flags that have been planted on the grounds of the Library of Congress, and you say that they ought to be removed. And you go on to give this person advice about how to complain and have them removed. Do you remember that post?
My social media is in my personal
Do you remember the
capacity.
post?
My
Do you
social
remember
media is
the
in
post?
my personal capacity, Senator.
I have to say, I have been here for 4 years in the Senate. I have never seen a witness stonewall like this before. Never. And I've seen a lot. This is extraordinary. Do you remember this post? December 3rd, 2021.
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
I mean, this is unbelievable. And you want to be the archivist of the United States. You lied to us under oath. You lied to us in your QFRs. You just lied to me a second ago under oath. And now you're sitting here stonewalling, not answering questions about public posts that you've made. Are you a lawyer, Ms. Shogan?
No, Senator.
Are you familiar with the Shirtliff case at the United States Supreme Court?
No, Senator, I'm not.
Well, in that case, the Supreme Court held that, in fact, it constitutes viewpoint discrimination for a government entity to remove religious flags from its property when it's opened up the property to allow other people to put flags on it. Exactly the question that you were addressing in your public posts on Twitter. You're giving legal advice, which you're not qualified to give, directly contrary to the United States Supreme Court. I just wonder, does this have to do with your view that you wrote about that the religious right is connected to the rise of anti-intellectualism in American politics? Is that why you said what you said about religious flags, that the religious right is a force for anti-intellectualism? Explain that to me.
No, Senator.
Do you stand by your comment that the religious right is part of the rise of anti-intellectualism in American politics?
Senator, that article was written. It was about how Republican presidents use common sense terminology to effectively communicate with Americans.
Yeah, in which you said that the religious right, the rise of the religious right is part of the rise of anti-intellectualism in American politics. I just point out that's the article in which you say anti-intellectual, the title is Anti-Intellectualism in the Modern Presidency, Republican Populism. Very nonpartisan. Dr. Shogan, I'm going to ask you again, will you give to this committee your public posts on Twitter? Will you make them available to this committee?
My social media is in my personal capacity.
Mr. Chairman, I have to tell you, this is the most extraordinary thing I have seen in my brief time in the Senate. I have never seen a witness blatantly lie under oath like Dr. Shogan has just done to this committee, stonewalled this committee, and just repeatedly refused to answer my questions about her own posts that are in public. For these reasons, I will oppose your nomination, and I strongly, strongly urge this committee to take action on this and force this witness to own up to the fact that she is misleading us right now before our eyes, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Carper, you're recognized for your questions.
Thanks. Shogan, Dr. Shogan, why don't you take a minute and just to respond to some of what we've heard from Senator Hawley, please? And I promise not to interrupt you.
Thank you, Senator. I would like to highlight my nonpartisan record that I have achieved for the past 15 years in service, in public service. 8 years at the Congressional Research Service, 4 years at the Library of Congress, and the past 3 years at the nonpartisan White House Historical Association. I have worked very effectively with Republicans and Democrats in all of these capacities. When I worked at the Congressional Research Service, I worked with hundreds of members of Congress and senators, committees, majority and minority alike, walked into offices, helped them get from point A to point B, regardless of their partisan affiliation. In my current job at the White House Historical Association, I came to the White House Historical Association. I accepted the position late 2019. Started the job in early 2020, and when President Trump was the President of the United States, worked very effectively with that White House, and then of course now with President Biden in the White House, I've worked very effectively with that White House. So I stand very strongly behind my professional nonpartisan record, which I think speaks for itself.
With the information we just heard from my colleague, is this official? Is this like government emails? What? I don't really understand the source of them. Just explain it.
No, that's social media in my personal capacity, as marked as such.
Okay. It'd be interesting to see what social media in our personal capacity look like for some of the folks that we serve with. Mm-hmm. And so I thank you for setting the record straight. I want to begin by thank you for joining us for today's hearing and for your willingness to serve our country. I'm a veteran, last Vietnam veteran serving here, especially appreciative of the work in that regard. But over the last decade, the National Archives and Records Administration has been putting together the tools to transition the federal government from paper to electronic records. And as the chief administrator of NARA, the Archivist plays a critical leadership role in the transition, as you know, to digital records, and providing appropriate support to staff will be crucial in the success of the transition. Here's my question. With that said, what administrative or policy changes would you implement at NARA in order to ensure the agency has the appropriate resources to carry out this transition from paper to digital? And how will you ensure the staff has the support and training that they need to efficiently accomplish this feat?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. It is a very big challenge for NARA moving forward, the transition from predominantly analog to a predominantly digital archive. The first challenge, I think, Senator, will be that paper records aren't going anywhere. Paper records have existed since the beginning of the Republic. So as the transition moves to digital records after June 30th, 2024, when the OMB directive is implemented, the National Archives will still have to deal with paper records while they transition. So to use a sports analogy, if you're a good basketball player, you have to be able to play offense and defense. And the National Archives will have to be able to also serve paper records while they make the transition to digital. So that will be the first challenge. The second challenge, I think, Senator, will be that when those digital records come to the National Archives, the question will be, are the agencies providing the correct data that accompanies those records? Because as you might imagine, there's going to be an exponential increase in the number of digital records compared to analog or paper records. So what will really matter is that if the accompanying data with those records will help our users find the records that they need. So I think that's going to be a major challenge. Going forward, the archives, we will need to provide correct training for staff because, just as I said before, the records have increased exponentially, but the budget has not increased exponentially. So staff needs to be trained to be able to make this transition from paper to digital, and there will be different requirements for things like metadata. And we can rely upon a very strategic use of training to be able to make sure staff are ready for that transition. And once again, being able to continue the servicing of the paper records while NARA becomes a predominantly digital agency.
All right, thank you. One more question. Dealing with the ability of the National Archives to adapt to advancements in record-keeping technology. And in 2014, under my leadership as chairman of this committee at the time, I think with Tom Coburn as my wingman, we passed the Presidential and Federal Records Act, which, among other things, certified that electronic records should be treated the same way as paper records. As a result of that clarification, NARA has seen an increase in the volume of records that they are required to collect and to preserve. These records document the important work of our federal workforce conducts on a daily basis and need to be properly collected and preserved. As such, NARA requires the resources to ensure that proper protocols are in place to collect and maintain both paper and electronic records. Question. Dr. Shogan, how do you see NARA being able to adapt to advancements in record-keeping technology to collect and preserve both paper and electronic records? And do you feel NARA has the resources to do that while responding to record requests?
Thank you for that question. As I said in the previous answer, this is going to be the challenge to be able to continue to service paper records as well as moving forward with the advancement to digital. And I think the answer to that, Senator, is that the federal agencies that are, of course, providing the records, whether they're paper or digital, need to engage earlier in the process. And this will be NARA's responsibility to provide education and oversight to those agencies to get them to engage earlier in the process so that their technologies and their data, once again, will meet the needs for our users. I do not come to this as an archivist by training, but I do come to this as a user of the National Archives. And I look forward to bringing that perspective as a user to the National Archives as we move forward into the digital future.
Thank you. All of us on this committee and in the Senate and the House receive inquiries from our constituents. A lot of them are veterans, and the issues that are raised are veterans, and I'm especially interested in seeing us be able to provide better responses in that regard. Thank you so much for your willingness to serve in this role. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Marshall, you're recognized for your questions, and welcome once again to the committee. We'd love having you here.
Thank you, Chairman Peters. Glad to be here, and welcome, Dr. Shogan. We're glad you're here as well. Dr. Shogan, as you know, over 1 million Americans and over 10 million people worldwide have died from COVID. Recently, the Department of Energy released information that they've changed their mind, and they believe that this virus originated in Wuhan, China, joining our own FBI. Earlier, you committed to Ranking Member Paul to try and declassify older records. Do you feel that America deserves to know the origins of COVID, and will you do everything possible to declassify these recent records, including why the Department of Energy changed their mind?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. It's nice to meet you, and welcome to the committee. We didn't have a chance to chat before. Senator, as I understand it, the agencies that classify records also hold the responsibility to declassify those records. So that would not be in the direct purview of the Archivist of the United States. But nonetheless, at the National Archives, there is a principal value is a value of transparency. So I will be responsive to any requests that you might have while following the law. And of course, in areas of classification, you know, finding the appropriate balance between transparency and, of course, critically protecting our national security.
I want to talk for a moment about the storage of data done from research funded with United States dollars and how you feel your role would be in this. In September of 2019, the Wuhan Institute of Virology terminated access to an important database that was populated with genomic sequences resulting in part or from United States-sponsored research. We still don't have access to that data. Similarly, in 2020, the WIV removed genomic data stored at our own NIH Genomic Lab Bank here in this country. What are your plans to require hosting of data for U.S.-sponsored research in the United States? And what are your plans to pursue any type of punitive actions against the Wuhan Institute of Virology for terminating access to our data paid for with U.S. dollars?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I'm not familiar with some of the facts that you have just explained to me, that I have not been briefed about those matters, but if I am confirmed as Archivist of the United States, I promise that I will look into those matters. I'm happy to meet with you or meet with your staff to follow up on those matters.
Do you believe that if the U.S. is funding that type of research, that it should be transparent, it should be stored, it should be available to the public?
I believe that all agencies must follow the requirements and dictates in the Federal Records Act.
Okay. In 2017, it was discovered that the NIH was deleting records. While a number of those records have been fully or partially recovered, many have not. NARA has acknowledged receipt of an NIH report about the record deletion, but to my knowledge, has not been made public. Are you aware of this report or the subject of the deleted files? And are you willing to submit them to this committee for further review?
Senator, I've not been briefed. I'm not privy to those details, but I will be responsive to you under the requirements of the law, for sure.
And will you make those records available to this committee, if not publicly?
If I am confirmed, I will follow the dictates required in the Federal Records Act and all associated regulations, Senator.
Okay. Kind of change subjects here for a second. Last Congress, I was shocked to find out that the National Archives had and continues to label our founding documents as containing trigger warnings. That's right, the National Archives on their website states that the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights contains harmful content. I introduced legislation with Senator Risch to remove these designations and would like to understand your personal opinion on our founding documents and the role of the National Archives in sharing them with our citizens. Do you believe personally that the Constitution and our founding documents are harmful?
Senator, absolutely not.
Do you think we should remove that warning label that there are trigger warnings there?
Senator, there is a harmful content warning, but it is on all results when you use the NARA's online catalog. It is not attached to any one record, such as the United States Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. Previously, when I testified before this committee, I did state, I believe to Senator Lankford, that I would be willing to work with him about the language of that warning. And I stand by my promise to do so if I am confirmed.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Marshall. Ranking Member Paul had 2 minutes left in his time that he graciously passed to allow members to speak. Ranking Member Paul, you're recognized for 2 minutes.
You know, I was favorably inclined by your answers, particularly that your role as the archivist is ministerial with regard to certifying amendments to the Constitution. Also, on your, I think, forthright answer on the, whether or not you'd force people to cover their T-shirts. And I thought those were great responses. I guess I'm a little bit sort of torn, though, with the whole idea of that, your Twitter is private. We tell our kids it's not, and be careful what you post on Twitter. Everybody knows that. And so the problem is that, see, if I have an intern in my office, we actually do look at their Twitter. And if they say bad things about people's ethnicity or their private life, they make sort of aspersions or act as if they're bigoted in any way, we won't hire them as an intern, much less as a person. So, this is advice for everybody. You got to really be careful what you post. Now, being a liberal should not disqualify you. But the one question on whether or not, the Library of Congress should take down flags does kind of go to the heart of what we would do with records and things, and whether or not, that shows a bias that might enter into the decision-making, as an archivist. And so it does worry me. Not that you're liberal. I mean, that doesn't, I think if we got rid of liberals, we might not have a lot of librarians or archivists, frankly. But I am worried about the idea that you would, advise people at the Library of Congress about, taking down religious flags in a public place. I think it goes against the law, but then in not answering the actual issue, and I know it's difficult in a cross-examination to decide, but by not answering the subject about religious flags, it worries me that what we're getting is a public place as opposed to, what you say in private, which may not meld together. Do you have any comment on that?
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for that question. If I am confirmed as Archivist of the United States, without reservation, I will welcome all Americans to the National Archives. I will welcome them enthusiastically to the National Archives. I stand 100% behind that sentiment. I have a record of doing so at the Library of Congress, where I oversaw visitor services for several years, and I will continue in that tradition. And you have my promise and my word on that.
Thank you, Ranking Member Hall. Senator Ossoff, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Shogan, good to see you again. And I congratulate you again on your nomination. You and I have discussed this issue previously, so you won't be surprised to hear that I'm eager to hear again your commitments to work with me to address the significant delays that veterans are experiencing accessing their service records. As you know, Dr. Shogan, to access their VA benefits and other services to which they're entitled as veterans, veterans need access to the military service records, which are in the custody of the archives. And the good news is that with Chairman Peters' support, last year I introduced and passed into law the Bipartisan Access for Veterans to Records Act in order to address the serious backlog of requests for access to military service records. And in your hearing last September, you committed to working with my office to address that backlog. So I want to ask you again, now that my bipartisan legislation is law, will you commit to working with me swiftly to eliminate the backlog of veterans' record requests at NPRC?
Senator, thank you for that question. Absolutely.
And what is your understanding of the latest state of that backlog? What efforts are underway now to address it? What do you think will need to be done if and when you assume this office in order to eliminate it?
Senator, I think there is good news in that regard. The backlog is down to about 330,000 requests. The height of the backlog was over 600,000 requests, so that is good progress. And the projected timeline for completion of the backlog or elimination of it is in December of 2023. And if I am confirmed, I promise to make my first trip as Archivist of the United States to St. Louis, to the National Personnel Records Center, to see the operations on the ground, to figure out where we can find efficiencies, to make sure that we are using contractual authorities to the highest extent, to make sure that work gets done in an expeditious fashion. And also to explore any other creative solutions where we might be able to move that deadline up. Although ambitious, December 2023, I think we could all agree we would like to have that sooner if possible.
Thank you, Dr. Shogan, and let's talk now about civil rights cold cases. Black Americans who, in the segregation era, were dragged from their homes, abducted, assaulted, lynched, subjected to horrific abuse and murder for which there was and remains impunity. Some of the most horrific crimes in our national history, they were never prosecuted. And the descendants and survivors of those victims are still with us. They rightfully demand justice. The good news is that we're making some progress toward securing justice. And last Congress, I passed into law the Bipartisan Civil Rights Cold Case Investigations Support Act to give the team tasked with investigating these civil rights cold cases the time they need to pursue justice. The archives have an important role to play in supporting those investigations. If you're confirmed, will you use your authorities to the fullest extent you can under the law to support those efforts to investigate civil rights cold cases, those unsolved lynching, those unsolved assaults and abductions from the segregation-era South?
Absolutely, Senator. I think that falls under the archive's priority of providing access to populations that need access to those records. We talked about veterans previously. That's, of course, so the veterans can claim their benefits. And in this instance, it's so that people can claim justice.
Thank you, Dr. Shogan. Constituents will be relieved to hear you make that commitment. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Well, I'd like to thank you again, Dr. Shogan, for joining us today and for your willingness to serve in this very important position. The nominee has filed responses to biographical and financial questionnaires, and without objection, this information will be made part of the hearing record, with the exception of the financial data, which is on file and available for public inspection in the committee offices. The hearing record will remain open until 12 p.m. tomorrow, March 1st, for the submission of statements and the questions for the record. Seeing no other members here to ask questions, this hearing is now adjourned.